Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in another minute or so. We're just going to give people time to get on. But in the meantime, you can familiarize yourself with WebEx if you are not used to this platform. On the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see something that says chat and participants. You can minimize the participant list if you want to and click on the chat so that you're able to see the chat. We are asking that as we go through our presentation today, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat message box, and then we will get to the questions as we move through our discussion. And if you have any issues, technical issues, things like that, hopefully, again, you can share those in the chat. Things have been going smoothly the last 3 weeks, so hopefully we can continue with that. But again, if you have any issues, please do let us know in the chat box. So I'll give it another few moments and then we will get started. All right, I see that our numbers are going up as people are joining. So we will get started with some of our introductory information so that we have as much time as possible to hear from our two guests. So first, I just want to introduce myself, and my name is Nicole Horvath. I'm the Environmental Outreach Coordinator for WSSC Water. For those who may not be familiar, we are the water utility for Prince George's and Montgomery County, and the Patuxent River serves as the source of drinking water for 1/3 of our customers. So that's why we care about the river and what happens to it north of 95. So it does go north of the river, and WSSC Water helps to protect that area. So today is the last of our webinar series, the Patuxent River Reflections Conference. Obviously couldn't happen the way we would have hoped, which would have been actually this week. So when we came together as a planning committee, we thought, let's do some webinars so we can get some information and research out to our community and have some discussions, even though we can't be together in person. So thank you all for joining, especially to those of you who have joined throughout the past 4 weeks. This conference, and as with anything else, couldn't be possible without sponsors who help us to offset costs. So here, a list of our sponsors. We have the Maryland Indian Tourism Association, Maryland Humanities, Bourne Environmental, Patuxent Tidewater Land Trust, and the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Center. So again, thank you to those organizations for sponsoring us and for helping to make everything that happens with PaxCon happen. Just some ideas for you all for WebEx, just so that you know, we are recording this presentation. So if that's something that you're not comfortable with, you can exit and then watch the recording later, just so that you know if your video is off and you are muted, then you will not be recorded. It's just the active speaker and whatever is on the slide. So if you don't feel comfortable having your video on, we totally understand that. It also does help to take care of bandwidth depending on where you're watching from. So today, as I said, we're going to have an active discussion with two champions of rivers here in Maryland. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you more about what they do. But we have Mr. Fred Tutman, who's the Patuxent Riverkeeper, and then Trey Sherrard, who is the Anacostia Riverkeeper. So they both are going to have some time to share with you the work that they do in terms of the river that they work on. And then we will have a moderated discussion. So if you have questions about outreach and advocacy around rivers and watershed health, please put those in the chat and we'll get to them as we go. So just bear with me for a moment while I pull up Fred's slides and we get started. But Fred, if you want to come off mute, I'm going to mute myself, but if you want to start introducing yourself while I get the slides up, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks, Nicole. I appreciate it. So as was said, I'm Fred Tutman. I've been the riverkeeper on the Patuxent for the last going on 17 years. And quite a ride, actually, because I really thought I would do this for 5 years and then go do something else. And I've really fallen in love with the work and the interactions we have throughout the watershed with people who really care about what's happening to this river and have a real deep appreciation for its activist history. And in some sense of the word, you can put the first slide up, if you would, Nicole, right after this one. I really believe that the heart and soul of this river protection movement on the Patuxent, which has an enormously interesting history attached to it. A lot of people are familiar with the Bernie Fowler movement, but a lot of people do not understand that the Bay protection movement grew out of the Patuxent River. Actually, it was Patuxent River lawsuits back in the 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s that kept banging on the state of Maryland to fulfill the Clean Water Act and actually protect the river from the upstream discharges from the urbanizing section of the river. And what they found through the course of these litigations and various legislative efforts was they couldn't get enough people on board in the Maryland General Assembly to protect a single river. And so at that time, Governor Harry Hughes said, let's start a Chesapeake Bay program. Then everybody will come to the table. So the genesis of this entire regional movement to protect local water is built on the backbone of a very activist Patuxent River that really led the way, that really led the charge. And so to some extent, I've taken pretty seriously the need to protect that grassroots legacy, because the grassroots can't be defunded, cannot be put on the skids, put on the back burner. Right, the squeaky wheels in this watershed have historically been the ones that have produced the most water quality gains. So when I was talking to my therapist right here in this picture, looking forward, which is hard to do right now because as Tommy Baden, who's on the call, knows, it's very hard to plan for what to do next year when you have an epidemic staring you in the face. But I took to heart the questions that were suggested questions that were given to us about that we might respond to. So the key to success, next slide please, is to treat the activism like I do blacksmithing, right? Something I love to do, and I do it throughout the watershed. I do it in Howard County, I do it in Prince George's County, and do it in other watershed areas. I actually believe in investing my own volunteer time into the counties where we work, because I believe that brings us closer to the communities where we stand in the shoes of members or participants in the community, rather than people who are lecturing to the community, trying to tell people what to do with their environmental practices and so forth. So to me, the connection between riverkeeping and blacksmithing is something where you work on something that's hot, it's volatile, it's in an environment that's very dynamic. Sometimes the steel is unyielding. You have a picture in your head of someplace you're trying to get, but it's something that takes a great deal of care and a great deal of force sometimes, but it's gentle force, less than you might think, to move something that's enormously hard, tensile, strong in a very tensile way. And I think activism kind of functions in much the same way. So the big question is, next slide, please. You really have to listen to the communities in which we interact. We don't ride in on a white horse and tell people, you need to be doing this, that, and the other thing with stormwater or with your lawn fertilizer or something like that. We go into communities where we can discern some of the most troubled and difficult problems that we can find, because we believe that if you work where the hardest problems are, those other problems don't seem nearly as serious or severe. So in the case of Eagle Harbor, one of many communities we work with on the waterfront of the Patuxent River, what they were talking about was flooding in the town from Coleman Creek, actually, one of the creeks that runs right through the center of the town. And we worked for a period of years actually with the town to work on various issues and problems, eventually helped the town find a grant in order to restore Coleman Creek. Some of that work has actually been held up because of the epidemic. There are various administrative delays and other things that have to be done. But this is something that was uppermost on the minds of the town, that our ability to build trust with communities and to work with them on problems that were on their minds, rather than the problems that are on our minds, or the problems we're being funded to work on, or any of that stuff. The agenda has to really belong to the community. And that's how I think you create durable work in these watersheds. Next slide, please. So, we connect with a lot of different communities that often get overlooked and ignored. We work with Native American communities. We work essentially in BIPOC communities, as well as we do everywhere else. When I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, people of color. But that's not an exclusive thing. We believe ideologically that this needs to be a big bandwagon, that everyone needs to be welcome at the table, and that everyone needs to be able to express themselves environmentally, to come to this movement that we're trying to build, this community that we're trying to build on their own terms. And so we have no preconceived ideas about what people should be doing. If people want to have a ceremony that observes Native American traditions on the river, great. We're happy to help facilitate that, because we believe that makes a bigger bandwagon and a much richer movement overall. Next slide, please. I think something that gets overlooked and misunderstood about what environmental justice is that it actually affects everyone, that it's not just something that connects to BIPOC communities. First of all, most of the environmental justice problems we have are actually public debt problems. They are enormous backlogs of problems that have been ignored for so long that they've actually become expensive cleanups. essentially. It's not the same as conservation, at least I don't see it the same way, where we're trying to prevent harm from occurring. We're often trying to go back and fix something that was broken a long time ago. Inadequate stormwater stuff, brownfields, poisoned lands, all kinds of things that come up. But the key to getting the mass that you need in order to really fight these issues effectively, when I say mass, I mean public mass, is that you have to give people and communities the ability to self-determine. They have their own ideas about what they need and what they want. The problem with big greens some of the time is they swoop into these communities and try and connect all the available environmentalism to exactly the thing that funds them. And in effect, that takes away from the community the voice that they might have to work on local problems and local issues that they have on their plates. And so in my view, it's not durable work. That kind of work disappears when the grants disappear, or when the big greens disappear, or when the career environmentalists go away. The kind of seeds I feel we're planting in the Patuxent River are seeds of work that will continue long after Patuxent Riverkeeper is gone, long after Fred Tubman is gone. That, to me, is the secret of the Patuxent. That is the Bernie Fowler movement. It's multi-generational. It keeps going on its own momentum because it's not contingent on corporate sponsorship, which is not to say that I think that's a bad thing, that corporate sponsorship is a bad thing, only that it is a different thing. It does very different things than does community-based activism. Next slide, please. I don't have many of these, by the way. I'm winding down. So another place we're working on is Lothian on Sands Road, where you have multiple facilities in Anne Arundel County that are either poorly regulated or have zoning discrepancies and other issues that put intolerable burdens on the community. And these are not the kind of problems we find in wealthy, well-off, well-appointed neighborhoods. These are the problems that generally accrue to places where people have less power, less of a voice in their affairs. That the solution to these problems is not for us to swoop in like Superman with a cape and try and single-handedly fix these problems, but to work in partnership with these communities so that they can stand up and fight them on these problems on their own. And again, it's work that will retain itself and retain its character even after our own direct participation at Patuxent Riverkeeper may have moved on. Next slide, please. So this is indeed community-based work in the sense that we're building community, lots of different types of communities. The paddling community we serve, the folks who want to worship water, we serve them. The folks who want to study water, we want to serve them. They're not all the same folks. They don't all want the same thing. I think it's a huge mistake, and I hear this a lot in the Bay movement. We all want the same thing. The truth is, we all want the same thing on our own terms, perhaps. We all, in a general sense, would like to have clean water. But what people really and generally want is almost as individual as their fingerprints. And any movement that's serious about protecting these waters has to at least recognize that and accommodate that. There's a lot of talk right now, next slide, please, about diversity and equity and change. And those are essential things to have in any movement, I think, that's serious about cleaning up a waterway. The whole idea that only one group of people, one demographic, single-handedly is going to clean up the rivers because it has all the bright ideas, all the grants, all the funding, was here first. There are any number of arguments that I've heard. But the truth is, diversity undersells what is on the table. Actually, diversity is not the same as equity or equality. Diversity is a label. The truth is, people of color are stakeholders, leaders, people with ideas, people with deep wisdom about what happens on these waterways and the history of various issues and causes. So it's not an afterthought at Patuxent River. We have always, even well before there was a George Floyd or an event in Central Park that galvanized people's interest in this. And it's worth pointing out that grassroots movements generally, for the most part, tend to be diverse already. That the real problems with diversity, equity, and inclusion tend to exist in big, corporatized, heavily staffed organizations where the decision-making is top-down, right? In grassroots movements, that decision-making is so diffuse that they tend to have a broad and very diverse base to begin with. Next slide, which is probably pretty close to the last. We're pretty close enough. Yeah, so the vision. The vision is to retain a movement on the Patuxent River that is driven entirely by citizens' wishes, passions, and needs, to provide a clearinghouse so that the pilot light, as it were, is kept burning on the Patuxent River, a very significant and important river on many levels in Maryland. My human scale vision is that there be a successor to Fred Tubman, because I've never wanted this movement to be a Fred Tubman movement. That would be short selling it. It's bigger than Fred Tubman. It's always been a Patuxent River based movement. And the Patuxent River has many moods and many different communities attached to it. And so my hope would be that the next Patuxent Riverkeeper, I'm not retiring tomorrow, but I know that I should have started this process 17 years ago when we first started Patuxent Riverkeeper, that the durable work also is that you have to create your own replacement. And so we are alert to that. We're looking for that at Patuxent River. Through the people who flow through our doors, somewhere in that mix is someone who will bring that ethic into the next generation, because I think that's vitally important as well. So that's all I came to say. I appreciate it. Hope I stayed more or less within the time scale, and I'm eager to hear what my colleague on the Anacostia has to say.
Thanks, Fred. That's great. Trey, while I switch presentations, if you want to start introducing yourself, and I'll bring up your slides, and then when you wrap up, we will have our discussion.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Trey Sherrod. I am the Anacostia Riverkeeper at Anacostia Riverkeepers. So Fred and I get to play the same game of, is it a title, an organization, is it an identity? You know, what is it that we do? And it's also a privilege. So it's Anacostia Riverkeeper has an interesting split. So talking about the different audiences, you know, the Anacostia River, what's actually labeled the river on the map, 7 out of all 8.5 miles of the river are in the District of Columbia. And people think, oh, it's the district's river, and it is in some ways. But the district is only a sixth of the watershed that actually drains to the river. So while almost the whole blue squiggle on the map that gets labeled Anacostia River is in the district, almost the entire watershed that actually brings water to that river is in Maryland. And even with, particularly in Prince George's County, you know, half of our entire watershed is Prince George's County. It's something that a lot of people don't realize. So when we're talking about how to do these outreach, how to talk to the community, you know, it helps if the community even knows that the river is there. That's a big help. And it's something that we actually find reports going back 10, 15 years that say that a lot of people in Prince George's County had no idea that they had any relationship to the Anacostia River. You know, they may know that there's a stream behind their church, behind their school, running through their neighborhood. You know, in the counties, it's different than in DC, where a lot of the streams have actually been piped and covered up. There are plenty of damaged streams and hidden streams in the counties, but for the most part, the streams are streams. What people lack is the understanding that comes into the Anacostia River, and that they already have this relationship to the river, even if they don't know that what they're doing impacts it. So a big part of our work has been to introduce people to their river. So a couple of years ago, you saw hashtag come to the river. That was a ploy to try to introduce people to their river by all the things that are going on it. A lot of people may paddle. A lot of people may fish, either for fun or because they don't have another, you know, secure protein source. There is subsistence fishing in the District of Columbia, Prince George's County, and Montgomery County. People may just like walking on the trails. They may use the trail to bike back and forth from a job in one jurisdiction to home in the other. There's a 1,000 different ways that people encounter the river. There is a club of people who take really long, 15-foot long fishing rods and go out in a field, and they cast them as far as they can. And they have huge long tapes, and they measure who cast the farthest. And they are about 100 feet from the water there. There's this diversity that's not been reached out to well, even though the people have been living around these streams and around this river the whole time. So a big part of my work when I first came on, I'm about to wrap up my 9th year in the District of Columbia and my 9th year working on the Anacostia River and all the jurisdictions. And a big part of my work, I came on part-time. I've not been the riverkeeper the whole time. I started part-time just to start our volunteer effort. So you'll see that we're focused on 3 kind of big columns. We want to protect, restore, and connect. And the connect is the part that we're really going to focus on today. But when you dig into our little bullet points under those, you're going to see that there's quite a bit of overlap already. You'll see that water quality monitoring pops up a couple different times. You'll see 4 or 5 things about trash, between trash traps, trash reduction projects, cleanups. All of these things that we want to accomplish, they all intersect. I actually hate putting charts up like this because it bugs me when they overlap, but that's the nature of the work. Everything that we do depends on the people, and not just as them coming physically to volunteer or them helping become advocates with their various jurisdictions and the agencies and the government that are there, but also them just getting that relationship and knowing that they're a part of this watershed. So the way we do that is through physical actions like volunteer cleanups. We do it through direct education, like Friday night fishing. We do it with recreation. There's a lot of different ways that reach out to people, and it's because there's such a diversity of people and interests and ways that they come to the subject and to be interested in it.
Great, thank you. So we're going to move into our discussion. And just to make sure that there's not feedback between the two speakers and myself, I'm going to ask a question. I'll mute myself. And then Trey or Fred, one of you will have to be muted while the other one's talking, and then vice versa, just so that we don't end up hearing each other's speakers. So that will be, and then for those of you that are listening, please feel free as the discussion continues, if you have any questions specific to either a group that you're working with or the topic of outreach and advocacy, you know, especially given the current situation. For our speakers, please feel free to put those into the chat and we will get to those as they come up. So I'm just going to start with our first question. Fred, you kind of spoke to this a little bit, so maybe we'll start with Trey and then go to Fred if he has anything to add. But Trey, what do you see as the key to success when communicating with the public about, well, let's say river and water quality?
I guess if you want like one boiled down thing to start with, it would be to come in listening rather than talking. That's particularly important for me because I am a white riverkeeper in a predominantly not white watershed. So it's very important for a lot of reasons. I see you looking at me, Fred, to not come in with solutions to problems I don't even know if the community cares about, for one. Two, you know, like you just don't know what the community is interested in. You don't know what that public wants. The public, again, is just definitively not a monolith. And so you can't find common ground with your audience unless you know what they're actually interested in. And one very expensive way to do that is with public opinion survey work, which is effective, but a very much less expensive way and one that's easier and quicker and better for building the relationship overall is to just come in and ask some questions and then sit back and see where the conversation takes you.
Fred, is there anything you want to add to that?
Actually, I would ditto that. I could barely have said that better myself. There's so much embedded within what people know in these rivers, and you will really miss the boat if you ride in on that big white horse and I'm the expert on water. You really have to listen to what's on people's minds, and they will share with you such nuggets of deep wisdom if you care to listen, if you win their trust. And that, I think, is probably one of the richer personal dividends. I'm sure Trey would agree. There's some real characters in these rivers, people who really have been working these fights for a long time, who know stuff. We need them. And so it's vitally important that we have the ability not just to listen, but to be humble enough to actually hear what people are telling us. That's where the richness is in this work. I really do believe that.
So going off that question, how do you find those people? You know, how do you find the community members? Are you talking with them as you see them out on the river? Are you invited to speak? How do you find these people who already are out there? Either one of you who wants to start.
Since my mic is already on, ironically, they will find you if you're putting the right ideas out there, right? In our case, we've written and done a lot of media appearance stuff and have made clear that everyone is welcome, that everyone has a voice here. Nobody gets left out. Nobody gets left behind in this particular movement. It has had the effect of making it very difficult for us to find funding in corporate and other sources where they insist on knowing where the money is going to be, what messaging the money is going to be spent on. We're driven by communities, not by funders. The communities are actually who funds the work that we do. And so you find those people by putting the word out there. Very fast example, when I put out an article in the Bay Journal about taking off the blinders and being open to new ideas and, you know, being really open to BIPOC communities in particular, I had 2 board members quit overnight, but I had 5 or 6 people from the BIPOC communities contact us the next day asking, how do I get on your board? They found us because we were walking the walk and talking the talk. So it's easier than one might think.
Great, thank you, Fred. Trey, do you want to add anything, especially as someone maybe who's not from the region. So
Yeah, so
Greg's
I'm
very well connected to Patuxent, but what was it like coming in as someone not familiar?
It was fun. I'm originally from North Carolina and spent most of my life there. I had a couple years kind of wandering around before I decided to come to DC and get to the intersection of people and policy and environment. This is the place to do it, and this has been an amazing job for that. When I first came in and I needed to be simultaneously finding supplies and help to run cleanups and also recruiting audience to actually come out and be volunteers, I really just was looking for any kind of meeting, any kind of group that seemed like it might be allied, doing just like web searches, river this, environment that, universities, churches, clubs, any kind of organization that seemed like they might be volunteer and or environmentally, leaning. As I've gotten to know, and then that of course led me to a first round and a second round, and then this whole web of contacts as you move into different geographies and you move into different topical geographies too, because when you get into the faith community, all of a sudden they know churches all over the place, right? They know temples all over the place, and they're all fighting similar questions and have similar problems to solve. You find out that all the students in the district need volunteer hours. You find out the students in Montgomery County and Prince George's County need volunteer hours. And you find all these different pockets of people that are interested, whether it's selfishly because they need the volunteer hours or unselfishly because they just love the river or they just love this. You find them a lot of different places. I was chuckling because you mentioned like you were 2 for 2. You go to meetings and you meet people. If I'm doing a boat tour, when those are allowed again, hopefully soon, I'll go to the dock and I'll drop my audience off from the boat tour, and there'll be somebody fishing or somebody that's just there with their kid. And inevitably I have the same conversation with those people, hey, what are you doing? How do I get on a boat tour? This is what we do. It's how you can get involved. Oh, I'd love this. I'd love that part. And everywhere you go, if you're logoed or if you're clearly doing something for the environment, people will find you and they will be interested for the most part. What we do aligns with what a lot of people want to see, even if they don't know exactly how to go about making some of those changes.
Thank you all. Okay. Anything else to add before we move into question 2? Nope. All right. So both of you have talked about engaging communities, how you find people. What are some strategies, thinking about the participants who are here on the call, who maybe want to start doing this work, maybe not necessarily as a river keeper, but in the organization or agency that they work with? What are some strategies that have been successful to encourage citizen action? So not just the people who already are involved, but maybe going to that next step. How do you get to those people? Trey, you kind of alluded to service learning hours a little bit, but how do you get to those people to help people take action?
So, deep subject there. So our organization is heavily leveraged by volunteer effort, and we have 2 categories, at least internally. I don't know if I've ever talked about this openly or not. That's volunteer light and volunteer heavy. Volunteer light is the community service hours. I want a squeeze bottle. How about a T-shirt? I'll come to a trash cleanup. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's a different level of buy-in. And so, that happens mercurially, in the spring and that sort of stuff, where people need those hours or need to get outdoors or want to feel like they've done something to help contribute towards protecting water and doing local stewardship. Volunteer heavy, I learned about by working on the Appalachian Trail. That's where the Roughnecks came from, the Patuxent Roughnecks who clear snags in the river. Granted, we haven't done much in recent years because I've been on blood thinners and been afraid to go out and get cut or scratched on something, but we'll resume work. And I call it volunteer heavy because people invest real time and energy in getting trained and learning how to do the work safely and learning how not to disrupt these ecosystems where we're just trying to do minimalist work to make it possible for people to, get through the river without portaging any more than they have to. But there are other types of volunteer heavy. You can always find volunteer heavy. That's what I learned by working on the Appalachian Trail. If you're building a cool project, people will show up in droves. You're building a bridge. If you're changing the fate of a particular section of waterway with some particular issue, project, or activity, people really want a piece of that. They're hungry to do work that makes a difference. And so that's why we're never the stars, Trey and I, right? It's really the public who chimes in. There's no way you could pay for that kind of workforce. You have to find it in the way of volunteers. And that's where, you know, the program work comes from, is building projects that are attractive enough to get as much volunteer heavy as possible.
So I would go past that and say you need something that's enticing, like the really cool project. You need a diverse, ideally you have a diversity of projects so that they will apply to the diverse audiences that we're going to keep touching on, because, you know, there's all kinds of people out there with all kinds of interests. I've also found differences between episodic and regular or recurring volunteers. And that's a difference in opportunity. So we do our cleanups we try to do them semi-regularly, but they're at all different places in the watershed. Some of them are targets for opportunities. Some of them become little series that we build out. The funding for those is different from year to year. And so, like Fred was talking about, it's hard to predict next year with COVID. A lot of our work is just hard to predict next year because we don't know who's paying for it how yet. We know the categories of things we would like to do, but then those things pop up. And so that leads to very episodic work opportunities. And so that leads to very episodic volunteers. Some groups of volunteers are simply transient, you know, and DC in particular is a highly transient area. The counties are a little bit less so, but still somewhat. You know, anytime you're working with a college or a university, you know, you can expect to work with those people a couple times, and then most of them will be gone. A couple of them may get jobs nearby. They may become part of a deeper kind of network for you. But there is this whole swath of people that are only going to be once or twice, maybe once a year, but different spots. And then we've created a new program in the past couple years for Anacostia Riverkeeper, where we've begun doing water quality monitoring. That's been an entirely different experience because that's a regular recurring thing, 20 weeks in a row, spring, summer, and fall. It's got more training, so the volunteers that show up are showing up knowing that they need to do a training. Then they do the training, and so you've got a lot more hours of buy-in. They've bought in for as many hours just to get trained as somebody else might say to come to that one or those two cleanups that they do a year. And then some of those volunteers didn't actually make it, didn't fit their schedule during the summer. A lot of them came out a couple times and did water quality monitoring and helped us get that data. But we had some people that were able to come out almost every single one of those 20 weeks. And they do one or several sites. And so you begin to see this other category of person that wants to come out and do work on the regular basis. And it's not just because they have the schedule and the interest. It also builds it's a more of a community between the staff of our organization and those volunteers, and between the volunteers themselves, because they're working in teams. You know, they're starting to socialize with each other a little bit. They're starting to trade information so that they can coordinate, and you see this entire other dimension unfold with their relationship to each other, and that reflects back on their relationship to us. And that gets away from the question a little bit, but I guess the strategy is that you create these different, you know, styles of volunteer opportunity, and then you see which ones get which bites from which people.
Yeah, I would say it's tribal, actually. I really get a kick out of seeing people who connected over Patuxent Riverkeeper license plates in the REI parking lot. A couple of roughnecks got married. We have a whole tribe that has emerged from some of this work where people share common interests. But I have noted even earlier today on this call, they seem to be different tribes within it, right? They're the paddle folks, right, who may not be on the same page as the people who like to test water, who might be an entirely different crew, you know, that want to have ceremony and do spiritual stuff next to the river. You have to really have an open slate to be willing to try and accommodate as much and as much of that as possible and make people feel at home doing what it is that they do really well.
Aside from creating different options, also having some structure. So that's the other big thing, is that's what prevents a lot of people from doing this stuff on their own. And in COVID, we've actually created a couple of forums for trash pickup at home, especially because we didn't do a single cleanup. Normally, we would have geared up in March and been doing cleanups the whole spring, summer, fall. We didn't do any cleanups again until September after our big MLK Day event. So it was September before we were comfortable pulling people together to volunteer. And people have been eager to do so, but other people have been reticent to do so for their safety or their family's safety. And so we created a form that people can use to give us data from trash that they pick up on their own. So they can send us pictures and they can fill out the form, and then it's just that little bit of structure. And then it helps us gain some things like the information from their cleanup. It gets a social media presence from the pictures, but that structure helps them, you know, it helps push them to keep doing it, and it helps them get a little more out of it.
Great. We have a question, and if the person, Garrett, who asked this, if I don't convey this appropriately, and you are welcome to take yourself off mute and ask it. But the question is it better to create a team of volunteers and have them do, from your experiences, and have them do a variety of projects, or to train them on one specific thing? So Trey, when I read this, I think first about kind of the water quality, like those people were trained on were a set group of people trained on a very specific project.
It's not one or the other. It should be and it should be and whatever other things we haven't thought of yet. You know, again, the diversity of options and the diversity of people it will attract is the strength. And you know, there's not, I wouldn't say one is better than the other. If you are time limited or resource limited and have to pick one, you know, I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. Fred, you have a lot of different other options that are kind of more engaged, even because y'all have the facility.
Yeah, and they really do take on a life of their own, because you're right, they're driven by the affinity groups that form around doing those particular things. And I admit, and I don't always gravitate, I have my own biases. There are things I like to do, and there are things that I don't have a strong thing about. For example, I'm not much of a water tester personally. I don't think you need a PhD or a bunch of lab equipment to know when the water is inadequate. I mean, as much as that's important in a court of law and all that stuff. So I don't rally personally that much around that. There are other folks involved with Patuxent Riverkeeper for whom that's the baseline. That's pretty much what they want to do, to keep good records of what's going on with these with these rivers. So really what I'm acknowledging there is that all of this stuff is driven by what people feel passionate about. I feel passionate about activating people who really want to change something that's wrong with the river. I don't resonate quite so well with people who are very Pollyannish, who think everything's swell. As long as we keep sending checks to some environmental group or another, I'm sure these things will work themselves out. That's surely not where I'm coming from at all. I do believe in passionate, connective, and collaborative work towards common goals on this river. And I think America needs a lot of this right now. We are ripped apart by divisions, and water is a great theme to get people together on. No matter what your political party, no matter what your orientation is, generally, you can find at least something to agree on with water as the catalyst. Or the environment. Doesn't have to be water, just the environment generally. And I think that's pretty exciting stuff. So I like being in that soup, so to speak. It's a big soup. It's a big connection of lots of different people with lots of different interests.
Hey, Fred and Trey. I kind of have a two-part question for you guys. The first one would be like, so what are some of the biggest challenges you faced while being a riverkeeper? And then I imagine there's a lot of big challenges out there, but what also motivates you to keep up with the fight? I know, you know, it can be certainly daunting at times with your mission, but, you know, what is something that you find rewarding and keeps you coming into the office every day?
So I'm going to go out on a limb here, because I do have some context for other watersheds where I interact. Like Trey, I have some knowledge of North Carolina's political scene as far as how that affects local water. And I would say the Chesapeake Bay region has its own internal culture, largely centered on the terminus of these rivers, right? We drain to the Chesapeake Bay. Downstream is where the focus is. And the funding is very centralized, and so there does seem to be a monolithic culture surrounding saving the bay. Our focus has always been on a single tributary. We rarely stray outside of that, because we believe in a very heartfelt way that the Patuxent is a legitimate and important resource worth saving, regardless of its connection to the Chesapeake Bay or anywhere else. It is its own thing. Not everyone is discerning enough to really appreciate what that is, and so we do get banged on the head a lot by folks who think we're just off message. But the key message is retaining the sense of a Patuxent community. And it's a challenge to get people, to go back to your question, to recognize that distinction, right? A very fast example, I went to a workshop recently. It was advertised for anybody who wanted to work on water, local water. And I got to the front entrance, and a very nice lady signed me in, and she said, "Oh, are you here to save the bay?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'm here to save the Patuxent." "Oh, it's all the same thing." Not quite. It actually eroded my willingness to participate in a conversation where the discussion had been preordained. In other words, I couldn't get the Patuxent issues on the table if we'd already been told that we're only allowed to talk about where the Patuxent goes. Most of my life, I grew up next to this river, and it never occurred to me where the heck it went. It just came from that away and went the other way. All I knew what was right in front of me. As its riverkeeper, I have an obligation to have at least some appreciation for those vast numbers of conversations that need to occur in order to effectively protect it. So that's the challenge, is getting people to recognize the difference between big greens and little greens, between work that educates people about the river as opposed to work that actually changes policy and law. It's not all the same thing. It's all very, very different. And you have to have the toolbox organizationally to actually work on the problem you're working on, or you'll disappoint people greatly. Right.
So what motivates you then?
The excitement of actually making some kind of a difference. You have to appreciate that the career I came from, I got to be a watcher. I was a journalist. I got to watch and take pictures and write stories about things I saw, and I couldn't change anything because that would be stepping outside of the bounds. Then I fell in love with the idea of working with people and activist organizations on a single river in a pretty vital cause. The stakes are very high for what becomes of these rivers. And I felt that was work that I could spend 3 lifetimes doing. So yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. That's what motivates me, is I think we're doing something here. I think we're making something of a difference. We're not going to clean up this river all by ourselves, of course not. But I think we're a catalyst, a spark plug for something that's really hugely important.
Trey, what are your challenges, and then what motivates you?
Yeah, I'll start with the motivation, a part of it anyway, because I've never heard Fred and I talk fairly often, and I hadn't heard him talk about the transition from watcher to doer, and that very distinctly parallels my choice to move to this region and to look for this work and thrive in this work. For the record, I expected that I would be in DC for about 2 years, and I moved here 9 years ago. Actually, like right now, like right before Thanksgiving. I think this is officially my 9-year anniversary this week or next week, and most of my career, I started out working part-time, age 15, at a summer camp for nerd camp at UNC Wilmington, doing marine biology education. And I kept doing informal environmental education right through until now. Now it's just a part of my job instead of my whole job. But I've done formal education. I've done a lot of teaching of kids and some of adults. And I love the ripple effect of education. I love enlightening people. I love showing them new things and new places and new ways to think about the things that they've already known. But especially with like students, it's really cool to know that they're going to go forth and do awesome things. And it turns out I'm not that patient. I want to see things happening now. So watching them progress is great, but I want to see things changing now. And my training is as a marine biologist. So I've done a few stints as doing actual hard field research for biology and marine biology. And I love making information. Don't get me wrong, science is amazing. I love it. I love the mindset and the philosophy. And those are more useful to me, I think. The actual process of making information is awesome. But that information just sits on a paper unless someone actually pulls that paper into a policy and implements that new change in information, and that information actually gets some traction. So I kind of got tired of making information and sharing information, but not seeing information implemented on the ground. I wanted to move somewhere where I could see change happening. And at that point, 9 years ago, I decided that needed to be the intersection of people, policy, and environment and science. And so that's why I moved here. And that continues to be a lot of my motivating energy for this. As we do things, we started an advocacy program about toxics 6 years ago, and we got a final legally binding document this year. And it takes forever, but it's stuff that I've been able to watch from the same position in the same place. And we see these things going stepwise forward and forward. We get to install green infrastructure projects and know that from henceforward, that thing that was ever since they got paved a problem, the next 10, 20, however long years before it needs to be maintained again, that is solving a problem instead of creating a problem. And those kinds of implementable changes are huge for me. Challenges, like I mentioned, a lot of people in Prince George's County still don't necessarily relate to their river. I don't know if, Fred, you have this issue with the Patuxent, but in the Anacostia watershed, half of our watershed is there, but a lot of the people in that watershed don't know they're in it. They don't know that they have a watershed address, never mind that it includes the Anacostia River. They know about this stream or that stream, but that's where their water world, as it were, kind of ends. And that's a problem for our messaging and for just the work in general. Organizationally, the biggest challenge is funding. I mean, it's always about funding. We have this water quality monitoring program, and we actually a year ago got a grant to expand that water quality monitoring work, to train volunteers in Prince George's County and Montgomery County to move into the tributaries. And it went awesome. We got these people excited despite COVID. We had virtual trainings. These people were going out there. They were driving the miles and miles to bring samples back to a central spot. They're going back and forth with us through all these different groups and chats and steps in the process for the better part of the summer and fall. And I don't have any funding for that for next year, right? So we are scrambling. We got these people excited, and now I'm going to feel like I let them down if we can't find a way to keep that work up for next year. But that's not all of these. When it's grant by grant and project by project, there is no guarantee of next year or whatever the end of the grant cycle is. And so that's hard, and that's especially hard when you add that sense of responsibility to the volunteers and to the constituents, on top of just not having the data, right? So we would like to have the data, but also these people got geared up for us. We asked them to do a thing, and they came out and did awesome work. And so now we want to make sure that we can keep them engaged and keep encouraging that kind of engagement, and not discourage it, because this could potentially set a very bad precedent, not just for our group working with them, but for other groups that might want to do overlapping work. But to end it back on a happy spot, the other thing that really keeps me energized in the work, Fred also mentioned the community around the Bay. For me, I've never been somewhere where there was so many other people doing overlapping or similar work. So Fred and I are 2 of the 17 water keepers in the Chesapeake Bay region that we all kind of see each other and interact pretty regularly. And that's helpful for lateral exchange, but also for just keeping, all right, cool. This is, I'm not alone in this. These are people having these same conversations. But in other groups working around the Anacostia, or other groups that work near. So even like WSSC, we may know each other socially, we know each other through work, and it's really cool to have a community of work social interactions that kind of overlap. And when you are feeling down about something, when you are just dragging, when you are worn out, whatever it is, that sense of it together, and that sense of you're part of this kind of sphere of people all working generally to improve the environment in this area or that's very helpful to me.
So if I may pick up on that, if that's all right, I think people generally assume that all of this great stuff that's being done around these watersheds will somehow miraculously result in a restored or cleaned up waterway. And as a waterkeeper, you learn pretty quickly there's a whole lot of stuff that nobody's doing at all, actually. There's a lot of gaps in that. In fact, I don't know about Trey's watershed. I've been above ground for a long time, and 60 some years. And I'm telling you, I haven't seen a plan yet that anybody's actually following on the Patuxent River that would intuitively lead you to the conclusion that we're going to clean this river up in anybody's lifetime. We're all doing a lot of separate, disparate stuff, but there really is not a plan that anyone's really following. And that's upsetting to me. It tells me that we're very essential, because we're filling in those cracks with volunteers, with unfunded work, with work that is necessary to keep that pilot light on. The reason I keep using that term, when I had my heart surgery a couple of years ago, I went around and interviewed some of the oldest and most venerable activists I could find on the Patuxent, because I had plenty of time on my hands and I had a driver. And I taped their conversations. And the thing that they told me was that the original Patuxent movement lit a pilot light. Actually, it was Bernie Fowler who had a cognizable political base. So he had people he could rally. And keeping that pilot light lit is immensely important, because people lose sight of with all the stuff we're doing, they lose sight of what the end game is, right? Testing this water is not a means unto itself. It's supposed to be a means towards an end, right? Picking up trash shouldn't be something we do, picking up exactly the same trash 1 year again later, right? We need to find sustainable solutions to these problems, or we've done nothing at all. And so that, to me, is what the visionary part of being a riverkeeper is. And we don't have that wisdom. That comes from the communities we serve. We'll find it together. That's what I think the mission is. So we're a different type of movement, founded on very different paradigms than other movements in many respects.
So we have a question from the chat, and Fred, I think what you said, I think a lot of people are starting to realize, right? And it's, I think, apparent in the volunteer work too, that there's so many different options and you need to kind of engage everybody. So can both of you speak to not just examples of what some of the gaps are, but do you have a vision? How do we get a comprehensive plan for the river? You know, the whole goal of PaxCon is to get stakeholders from across the watershed together. So what are some of the gaps, and you know, do you have an idea of how these various stakeholders who care about this river and its health could come together to meet some of those gaps?
Well, the biggest one I see is the absence of a lucid plan. Well, mostly what I see is aspirational. You know, I see watershed implementation plans. I see TMDLs that are incomplete or missed the boat in some instances. Someone said to me, actually, one of our colleagues, Trey, this morning, said they had a lot of dragons to fight on the Patuxent River. So I said, well, of course, we need a TMDL for dragons. You know, I mean, take a number. But I would say if we had a lucid plan, one that people were actually following as opposed to trying to mitigate it, pollution trade it, or in some way evade it, right? That would be one heck of a good place to actually start, because, right, you can monitor your progress towards that end game. I can't imagine us cleaning up any river in the spectrum of Chesapeake Bay rivers if we think we're going to keep on issuing permits forever, right? We have to at least retire some of those permits, right? Otherwise, we're really reaching those total maximums, right? Everyone wants the maximum. Maybe we need a minimum standard instead of a maximum. So there are problems in the regulatory sphere in terms of how we actually regulate these rivers. There are problems in the reality sphere in terms of what it truly takes to clean these rivers up. You know, that's not just aspirational, but we can actually track our progress and see how we're going. And now we have this movement that's grown up around these ideas, these aspirational ideas, where people are defending the original plan that really hasn't had the effects that we might have. Granted, it's better than nothing, but it's not likely to change the fate of these rivers in the foreseeable future. And these are, I think, emergency problems. These are the gaps I'm talking about, is the stuff we're not working on, or the stuff that we don't really have a good plan for, or the stuff where you just kind of hope it'll all fall in place somehow because everyone's doing all the right stuff by recycling and watching their lawn fertilizer and doing all that stuff. So that's what I think is really missing. Is it leadership? I don't think the government's going to clean this up without our kicking them in the butt. I believe that. Right, as much as they mean well. I'm not trying to, demonize the government workers. I mean federal government, state government, the folks that have the strong regulatory force on most of the issues we work on. So those are huge, huge gaps. And I think they're gaps in thinking. And some of those gaps we might fix with more intellectual diversity, not just ethnic diversity, but some new ideas, some new leadership, some new folks on the playing field. That's part of what we're doing too. Every kayak we rent, we're trying to evangelize this work to people who might pick it up and run with their piece of it. So I don't want to overtalk it, but I mean, you've asked questions that are deep wells. And so these are just scratching the surface. Anybody wants to talk about this stuff offline, I'm pretty accessible, or try to be.
Thanks, Fred. Trey, can you speak a little bit about, because I think it's probably maybe along the lines of what Fred was talking about, what the Anacostia Watershed Community Advisory Committee is and who makes that up? I know you lead that. So what does that look like?
Yeah, I'd love to. So it's part of a plan that was part of a partnership. It precedes me. So it was 15, 20 years ago, various jurisdictions between Prince George's County, Montgomery County, the district, some of the federal players, the state of Maryland, all convened the Anacostia Watershed Restoration Partnership because the state of the river had become too obviously awful for them to not actually do some work trying to get to it and try to fix it. That spun off 3 committees. One is a steering committee, so those are agency level directors from the jurisdictions. One is a management committee, which is the wonky science staff from the various jurisdictions and agencies and some nonprofits. And then the other one is the Community Advisory Committee. That's the one that I chair right now. And it's mostly stream groups. It's friends of groups. It's people that are not even at the, so my whole watershed is small. It's only 176 square miles. The folks that I'm talking about that are my colleagues on AUCAC, a lot of them are on sub-watersheds of sub-watersheds, right? So they have 5 square miles or 20 square miles. Things like Sligo Creek, things like the Northwest Branch, Indian Creek, a little bit lower Beaver Dam Creek, and a bunch more in both counties. And it's a place for us to have lateral transfer of information. We invite speakers to talk about plans that are ongoing now, projects that are upcoming. We touch base and connect on threats that we see. Right now we're talking a lot about the maglev and the Beltway expansion projects and the damage that they pose are probably going to cause to Greenbelt. And that's one that we share with Fred, right? Because those projects will both cross his watershed and my watershed. But it's a place where we convene and we can discuss, latest news, upcoming threats, upcoming opportunities, new grants. If you've heard of the past 5 years, the Festival del Rio Anacostia, that's one of the great things that came out of AUCAC. And it was a conversation that me and another fellow were having. We're 3 years in a row when we were talking about our goals at the same meeting each year, 3 years in a row. We're like, wow, we should really reach out to Latino people. And everybody's like, yeah, we should do that. That's great. And then the next year, what should we do this year? We should really reach out to Latino people. Whoa, that's great. And on the 3rd year in a row, we were like, why haven't we actually just done it yet? We both know Latino environmentalists and other groups. And so he and I kept each other honest, and we just did that. We just reached out to the Latino guys who were already environmentalists and environmental nonprofits. And instead of getting a subcommittee, we got a festival. So it kind of speaks to the power of the grassroots kind of connections, and that's one of the most valuable things that I've had in this work is being able to interact with all of those people from across the watershed who are really living this stuff. I have staff at Anacostia Riverkeeper. It is my full-time job. A lot of these people are not full-time anything to do with the water. They have their lives, and then on their volunteer time at night on a Tuesday, they come every other month and to this meeting, and they bring a lot of work and a lot of time that they've put into ideas and pulling in speakers. And it's kind of incredible to see what people can do when they really get motivated, and when there's these platforms to really help them do more with it.
Great, thank you. I know we are just almost at 1 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of people's time. My next question was going to be your vision for the river in 20 years. And I feel like that's a pretty heavy question with only a minute to go. So I don't want to give either of you a disservice unless you think you can wrap something up in a sentence.
Fishable and swimmable.
Say that again?
Fishable and swimmable.
Fred?
I would agree. And these are rivers well worth fighting for. So we got plenty of scientists. We got plenty of people who want to test water. We got plenty of people who want to educate. But we need to train and arm. I mean, arm not in the literal sense. I'm not talking about war. I'm talking about training people to fight, to struggle, to work hard, to protect what they love. If what they love is the river. That's what I see, is doing more of planting those seeds. No one's going to hand it to you on a silver platter, and you're not going to get it from a 9-to-5 job. To get clean water is revolutionary. You got to change a lot.
That's why paddling is important. That's why fishing is important. These recreational programs that we do, that yes, it's nice to do some quick education while you're out there, but you are creating people that are suddenly ready to become stewards later. Like, I do this work because I grew up at a beach and I loved water. That's why I did marine biology. That's how I met other rivers. And that's why I chose to work in environment and specifically in water, is because of my upbringing and the experiences I got early on.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you both for your thoughts. To everyone who was listening, like Trey and Fred have both said, they're both accessible. So if your group is looking to do projects and thinking about volunteers, definitely reach out to them and learn from their experiences and struggles and challenges. Just for everyone who's on, if you're still on, you will be receiving an evaluation for the webinar series. It helps us to do all the planning, to think about what's next and how we can continue to help this network of stakeholders for the Patuxent River. So thank you to Trey and Fred for being open to kind of us shooting questions at you and sharing your knowledge with everyone today. So thank you all. Hope everyone can go outside and get some sunshine. Enjoy your Thursday.